We're going to have questions at the end of the three papers. It's very, very interesting. Our second speaker this afternoon is Dr. Malcolm Mercer, who I think will be known to many of you. Do you want me to you just click on that? And then, yep. I have known Malcolm for quite a few years. He was at the National Archives for 10 years, the Royal Armouries at the Tower of London for 5. He is curator of tower history at the Tower of London. He has co-edited the volume for the Agincourt exhibition, and quite impressively, he has been the lead curator for that exhibition as well, which I should imagine has been a
change,
yes, absolutely. So this afternoon he's going to talk to us about Henry V and the Tower of London.
Thank you, Chris. On the eve of his coronation, subsequently remembered for the inclement weather and uninspired menu, but according to long-established custom, Henry V lodged at the Tower of London on the 8th of April 1413. Following in the footsteps of his father, Henry IV, he then made a number of Knights of the Bath. The creation of these knights can be seen as one of the earliest indications of the monarch drawing men into his orbit, and included a number who subsequently served in the 1415 campaign, like John Holland, Earl of Huntingdon and later Duke of Exeter, who survived, and Sir William Butler of Warrington, who died. Substantial parts of the ceremony appear to have been located within the White Tower, and there is some substance to Jeremy Ashby's suggestion that from the very outset of the reign, the new king was seeking to appropriate, quote, its antique associations to the service of the monarch, end quote, and encourage a sense of community within the realm. Whether one agrees with Ashby or not, Henry was at the very least emphasising the link between monarchy and authority. Constables of the Tower were traditionally drawn from leading aristocracy and royal servants trusted by the king. And from 1406, confirmed in 1415, the constable was Henry's kinsman Edward of Langley, Duke of York, who fought and died at Agincourt leading the vanguard. His replacement on the 25th of November 1415 was Sir William Boucher, who also fought at Agincourt. During the course of its 1,000-year history, the Tower has long been recognised as one of the most powerful symbols of monarchy. What, though, did it do on a practical level? When in 1597, Sir John Peyton, who was Lieutenant of the Tower at the time, wrote that it had 5 functions, he was already basing his assertions on 500 years of precedent, or perceived precedent. At the top of his list was military storehouse, followed by keeping of crown jewels and valuables, keeping government records, site of the mint, and a place for prisoners of state. What was not mentioned was the Tower as royal residence. By 1597, the Tower was no longer used as a royal residence. In fact, it was not regarded as a residence of first choice by monarchs from the late 14th century onwards. Nevertheless, building works undertaken at the Tower in the 14th and early 15th centuries reaffirmed its continuing symbolic importance. The 14th century had seen a number of amendments and additions to residential buildings. Architecturally, the south front had been strengthened and improved during the long reign of Edward III. The Great Hall had been remodelled and new royal apartments were created in the Cradle Tower. Later in the reign, between about 1361 and 66, the constable's accommodation had been improved. In particular, but unsurprisingly perhaps, stained glass worked with fleur-de-lis and borders of the King's Arms was installed in the windows. However, of more immediate significance were the improvements and alterations to the Tower Wharf. This is where we actually get to see a couple of images. I apologise for the fact that there is not one for the reign of Edward III. Ivan Lapper very inconveniently did not do a mid-14th century one, but basically you will see the wharf having extended right across the riverfront, across the tower. These had increased, the alterations, particularly to the wharf, had increased the tower's ability to receive and distribute goods, which meant that by the end of the 14th century, the stonework of the tower wharf stretched along the entire way for the face of the castle, making it easier for royal ships like the Catherine of the Tower, Gabriel of the Tower, and Paul of the Tower to harbour there in January of 1415. The late 14th century also saw some work undertaken on privy wardrobe accommodation, including a new house for its keeper, John Ludwig, between 1396 and 99. More about this privy wardrobe in a moment. The tower served as a centre for strategic planning and decision-making in the months leading up to the 1415 invasion. Following the failure of the last diplomatic mission, Henry V formally announced his intention to invade France and recover his rights to the kingdom. On Sunday the 10th of March, Henry had commanded the Mayor and Aldermen of London to assemble at the Tower, where he had then addressed them. The essence of his speech was to pressure them into making a loan in order to help him undertake the invasion. And several days later, members of the King's Council went to the Guildhall to hear how much the Londoners were prepared to provide. Henry and his council met a number of times during the spring and summer of 1415, probably within the White Tower, where its more spacious rooms could accommodate much larger numbers. And this is what the gentlemen of the Regency and early Victorian period thought that the council chamber must look like. The fact that it's big and it's in the White Tower was enough to recommend it. The fact is, we don't really know. Surviving records of the council show that a number of sessions held at the Tower between 12th and 15th of April. That between 12th and 15th of April, it was decided that letters should be sent to Charles VI, asserting Henry's claim to the French crown. Other practical matters included his note to speak to the Mayor of London about the price of armour, which he wanted to be sold at the lowest rates in advance of the campaign. As part of the propaganda campaign designed to justify Henry's claims across Europe, diplomatic records at the Tower were also utilised. During May 1415, Henry ordered that authenticated copies of the Treaty of Bourges of 1412, originally agreed between Armagnac lords and Henry IV, recognising his rights to territory in southwestern France, should be prepared for the Church Council at Constance. The treaty was accordingly sent from the Tower up the River Thames to the Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth. Yet it was primarily the Tower's core function as a royal storehouse, armoury and arsenal that made it integral to the King's plans for a military expedition across the Channel. And it is within the context of the Agincourt campaign and his subsequent campaigns in France that the Tower's role under Henry V should be more closely considered. Home to the Privy Wardrobe, it should not come as a major surprise that a significant part of the practical planning should have been undertaken at the Tower. Following the appointment of John Fleet as Keeper of the Privy Wardrobe back in 1338, when it stopped being an itinerating department, the Privy Wardrobe had gradually cemented its position as custodian of royal arms and armour at the Tower. By the early 15th century, the Privy Wardrobe's role as a department responsible for supplying and equipping royal forces was firmly established. Its principal accommodation was located in the Wakefield Tower, adjoining the royal apartments, and St Thomas's Tower opposite. That, for those who don't know, is the Wakefield Tower, and that opposite is St Thomas's Tower, and below that is what is called Traitor's Gate. By the early 15th century, the Privy Wardrobe at the Tower was holding both permanent and continually renewed stocks of arms and armour. As Tom Richardson's analysis of the surviving Privy Wardrobe accounts has clearly shown, that there were standing supplies of mail, plate, shields, crossbows, not traditionally associated with English field forces, but presumably used for sieges and combat at sea, longbows, and close combat weapons. In particular, his study has shown the centrality and importance of the longbow to the English military effort. There was also a shift from the storage of plate of knightly quality to plate for the rank and file, with quantities of old armour being retained in store well into the early 15th century. It is the period associated with Henry V that in effect witnesses the emergence of the Tower as an arsenal concentrating on the storage of munitions. Throughout 1414, additional stockpiles of arms and munitions were steadily gathered by officials of the Privy Wardrobe and the King's personal craftsmen and artisans. These items were specifically noted as being made for the King's stores. Once the town of Harfleur surrendered to Henry V on the 22nd of September 1415, the Privy Wardrobe was also active in securing and sending supplies for the town's defence and security, including pieces of ordnance. And as Henry continued his conquest of France between 1417 and 19, the Privy Wardrobe at the Tower organised supplies for captured towns and cities too. Contemporary records indicate that ordnance activity at the Tower increased substantially during the final quarter of the 14th century and remained active even during periods of peace. In fact, the continuous production and purchase of ordnance throughout this period had resulted in a store of 39 cannon of copper and iron by 1399, and there's no reason to suppose that this total declined significantly before the accession of Henry V in 1413. The account of the King's servant Gerard Sprong, submitted in 1415, included, for example, an iron cannon with 2 chambers called cliffs, 3 other iron cannon, and a cannon called a Fowler. And there were also 2 iron cannon called Bristow and George on Tower Wharf. I should thank Dan Spencer, who's speaking here later, of course, for that reference. Once a decision had been taken to invade France, royal officials were empowered to commandeer all necessary skilled labour in and about London in order to meet military requirements. The well-established tentacles of the Privy Wardrobe stretched far and wide into London's extensive community of merchants, craftsmen, etc. What stands out particularly from surviving records of the Exchequer are the significant quantities of gunpowder, or the constituent ingredients from which it can then be made, especially saltpetre. A number of these purchases were organised through Nicholas Merbury, who was subsequently appointed Master of Ordnance for the 1415 campaign. Others were made by men described as founders, gunners and even armourers, suggesting that there was no absolute division of labour within any of these more generalised tasks. Additional purchases were also made through third parties, of course, like the one from a certain Herr William van Isendornite, possibly suggesting a Low Countries origin. The other notable purchases were ordnance and bows. Attention is generally paid to the success of the English longbow at the Battle of Agincourt, yet the first phase of Henry's campaign should also be noted for its use of ordnance. In his letter to the Mayor and Aldermen of London on the 22nd of September, informing them about the capture of Harfleur, the King referred with pride to, quote, the strength and position of our cannon and our ordnance, end quote. The Tower and London artisans played a direct role in that success. William Gerardson, gunner, is recorded making guns for the King on at least 4 occasions during this period. So too was the King's smith, William ap Mercer, and his son Stephen. And in 1414 we find William ap Mercer also being authorised to impress smiths and other craftsmen into his service for producing guns and other ironwork within the Tower. The artillery storehouse at the Tower of London, evidence for which survives from the beginning of the reign of Henry IV, at least the presence of one, was probably the principal repository of this emerging military technology. Tower craftsmen and artisans were directly involved in the procurement and manufacture of ordnance. While the precise location of the artillery house remains unknown, there's a possibility that, like the later Tudor Ordnance Storehouse and its successor building, the Grand Storehouse, it was located to the north of the White Tower. This is a copy of 1597 plan of the Tower, traditionally called the Hayward and Gascoigne plan. And this is the Tudor storehouse. So I would suggest that probably it's being built on medieval foundations. There was already a precedent for Tower artisans to be located in this particular area north of the White Tower. In the early 14th century, the King's artilletor, or maker of artillery, Nicholas Conrad, was based in one of the northeastern towers close to the Queen's Wardrobe. So I think we're probably talking something like the Constable Tower, or within that area there. Whatever its precise location, however, ordnance was being purchased and stored on site, and it was also being produced by the Tower's own artisans and craftsmen, or, in the case of the great gun made on Tower Hill in 1418, manufactured in the immediate locality. Simon Fleet, keeper of the Privy Wardrobe from 1407, also made purchases of bows, bowstrings, arrows, and pavises, the defensive shields. Regular purchases of all manner of military and military-related supplies appear in central government records, of course. King's artisans, as one might expect, played a prominent part in this process too. The King's bowyer at the Tower in 1413 was Nicholas Frost, first appointed by Henry IV in 1405. And I can't see what I said there. The King's fletcher, Nicholas Minot, who had succeeded the presumably deceased Stephen Cedar in June 1413, is likewise recorded supplying arrows during February 1415. His accommodation was located near to the Wakefield Tower. The Wakefield Tower, which I showed you earlier, is just here. And that's St Thomas's Tower. Frost and Minot were both drawing upon the services of bows and fletchers in London during the summer of 1415 to produce supplies, undoubtedly as part of the military build-up. The construction and purchase of significant numbers of bows were also made and supplied through the London craftsmen Henry Bowyer and Stephen Flexner, both of whom stand out in accounts of the period as well. There's relatively little evidence for the production or purchase of supplies of defensive equipment for the nobility and their retinues, who were expected to furnish their own. London armourers, like Richard Grove, probably a relative of the armourer John Grove, of course supplied armour to the nobility as well, in Richard Grove's case, or in one particular instance, to John Duke of Bedford. But while spare equipment was presumably taken to replace items lost, damaged or beyond repair while on campaign, the Privy Wardrobe supplies were presumably intended for the royal household, and this probably accounts for some of the mail and armour supplied to the Privy Wardrobe by John Oakley, mail maker, and John Dean, armourer, between October 1413 and October 1414. John Dean subsequently joined the retinue of Nicholas Murbury in August 1417 when Henry invaded for a second time. This does not, of course, mean that suits of armour were not issued to members of the knightly class from royal stores. On the 16th of February 1415, Sir Hugh Standish of Duxbury in Lancashire, admittedly part of the old Lancastrian affinity there, successfully petitioned the King for a suit of armour from the Tower after indenting to serve across the Channel. But this seems to have been the exception rather than the rule. Other than being able to identify those armourers active in late 14th and early 15th century London, it's unclear which armourers contributed to the 1415 campaign. While there are plenty of deeds and related documents naming significant numbers of armourers, particularly amongst Corporation of London accounts, it's reasonable to assume that at least some of these, like Henry Reed and Richard Pearson, former apprentice of the leading armourer Simon Winchcombe, were amongst those brought in to work on behalf of the Crown. Armourers naturally accompanied the 1415 campaign army across the Channel, and the account for one, the otherwise completely obscure Longus Dederick, is enrolled wardrobe and household accounts. Sadly devoid of any meaningful text relating to his service, however. While the Privy Wardrobe at the Tower supplied the needs of the King's own forces in France, Henry V's personal armourers, Martin Pull and John Hill, supplied the particular needs of their royal master. While the Privy Wardrobe has superseded the Great Wardrobe's role in supplying royal forces during the early 14th century, the latter, the Great Wardrobe, was now primarily concerned with managing arms and armour for the King's use. The separation of responsibilities for the custody and procurement of arms and armour between the Privy Wardrobe and the King came about during the second half of the 14th century. Based at the Tower, probably in a house quote, near to the Tower where the Rolls of Chancery were kept, the Wakefield Tower, the King's Sergeant Armourers, as they were now generally known, produced and procured military equipment for the King's use. As plate armour gradually became more important, King's Armourers required dedicated workshop facilities, which appeared during the second half of the 14th century, and this is also reflected in the purchase of new tools and equipment by the King's armourer William Snell in 1374. John Hill was armourer for the King's body by 1408, and at the accession of Henry V seems to have worked in partnership with Paul, who was first appointed an armourer for the King's body in July 1413, probably replacing Lewis and William Fox, sons of Giles Fox, late armourer in the Tower, who had been appointed in January 1413. Not quite sure why they were replaced, but they were. I think it makes sense that one was a metal armourer and the other a linen armourer. The skills of linen armourers were still very much in demand, even though the relative balance had swung in favour of from metal to cloth. To metal from cloth. Of the two, though, I think Pull is more visible in records as a contributor of equipment for the forthcoming campaign. In April 1414, he was authorised to requisition the services of armourers and other craftsmen for the fulfilment of his duties. Regrettably, the absence of particulars of account for early 15th century King's armourers once again means that it's impossible to say which London armourers were working actively or directly with Paul or Hill at any particular stage. Nevertheless, entries concerning Hill and Paul show them supplying various items for the King, particularly breastplates, van braces, rail braces, helms and bassinets. The bassinets, in particular, were to be gilded in copper and covered in velvet. In one particularly long entry on the enrolled wardrobe and household accounts, Poole is recorded as making, supplying and transporting a particularly large consignment of arms and armour to various and secret locations. Included within it was a long sword called a passau, covered in velvet, garnished and furbished, and that is a long sword that will be appearing in the exhibition, as I understand it, forthcoming in October. The King's victory at Agincourt and his subsequent campaigns highlighted another important function of the Tower as a prison. The Tower had long served as both a local lock-up and a place to send those of whom the King wished to make an example of, as well as a prison for foreign captives, traitors and other important detainees. The Tower's role as a state prison had already been reaffirmed by events at the beginning of Henry's reign. The perceived Lollard threat had already led to the imprisonment of captured religious dissidents within its walls. That said, Sir John Oldcastle, the loyal leader, had managed to escape from the Tower in October 1413, one of a number of notable prisoners who have made a successful dash for freedom. In addition, the Tower had been the home to James I, King of Scots, captured back in 1406, until the order for his removal to Pevensey Castle in Sussex on the 22nd of February 1415, and a varying number of Scottish aristocratic and knightly hostages, including Murdoch Earl of Fife, the son of Scottish Regent the Duke of Albany. When Henry returned from France to be greeted by the enthusiastic celebrations of the citizens of London, he was able to show the assembled populace the captured French prisoners, a poignant reminder of the impact of the English victory. The high-status Agincourt prisoners were possibly sent to the Tower shortly after the King had made offerings at the tombs of St Erkenwald at St Paul's and Edward the Confessor at Westminster Abbey. While it was not the only place of imprisonment for significant detainees, during the course of the wars in France it did become the home to a number of high-profile residents, like Charles, Duke of Orleans, who, despite being moved periodically around the country, did spend a period of captivity within the White Tower, just like King John II of France had done after his capture at Poitiers in 1356. Orleans, as we all know, was finally released from captivity in 1440. The Tower was also used as a temporary prison for other French knightly prisoners before their removal elsewhere. As Remy Ambiol has noted, many French prisoners from Agincourt were home within a relatively short space of time. Between December 1415 and the summer of 1417, prisoners taken after the capture of Harfleur, who were being held at Calais, were transferred to the Tower of London by William Huddleston. And in June 1417, Sir John Bold was authorised to remove 8 of these, including Robert de Neville, Georges de Clare and Estor de Bocherville, to Conway Castle, and another group to Carnarvon Castle. And this pattern was repeated with other prisoners captured during Henry's reign, a short period of incarceration in the Tower before being moved elsewhere a number of times. Despite all that has been written about Agincourt and Henry V's campaigns in France, the Tower of London has received surprisingly little attention. Yet on a number of levels, it would appear that it did in fact remain essential to the English war effort throughout this period. It continued to serve as an important symbol of royal authority and power, a feature which had been used to good effect when persuading the mayor and aldermen of London to finance the venture. The wars, however, also revived and reinforced the Tower's role as a military arsenal and a centre for logistical planning within late medieval England. It stood at the heart of the English royal supply system. The Privy Wardrobe exploited its networks of mercantile contacts within London, the wider kingdom and across the Channel in order to secure the supplies needed by the king to launch and continue the conquest of France. And without the level of practical support, the period of English military success in France might well have been much briefer. Thank you.